What if a single photograph could rewrite a family's history? What if behind its frame, hidden for over a century, lay a chilling confession? A young woman declared dead in 1907, but was she truly gone? And who dared to write the words, "She was alive when we buried her"? Could a simple funeral portrait conceal a crime no one was meant to uncover? If you want to follow real stories that defy time and reveal hidden truths, subscribe to the channel now and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our investigations. It began with the smell of dust and old wood, the faint perfume of forgotten objects resting in silence for decades. The small antique shop had no sign outside, only a narrow doorway swallowed by ivy and shadows. Inside, shelves leaned under the weight of books with broken spines, porcelain figures chipped at the edges, and clocks that no longer dared to count the hours. The air was heavy, as if every item carried the residue of a life that had ended elsewhere. It was there, behind a pile of rusted lanterns and brittle newspapers, that the portrait was found. A frame of dark oak, its glass clouded by time, preserving the likeness of a young woman whose face seemed unnaturally pale even in the black and white tones of early photography. Her eyes were closed, her hands resting delicately across her chest, a bouquet of wilted flowers pressed between them. The family stood around her, rigid, unsmiling, as though the gravity of the occasion demanded no less. It was a funeral portrait, one of many common in the early years of the 20th century, when death was not hidden from view but confronted, solemnly and directly. Yet something about this image resisted the calm dignity it was meant to convey. The frame creaked when lifted, and from behind the glass came the faint suggestion of paper shifting in the hollow space. Time had preserved not only the photograph, but something else concealed where no eye was meant to look. With careful hands, the backboard was loosened, and there, pressed flat against the image itself, lay a folded piece of parchment, its edges browned and crumbling. The handwriting inside was hurried, uneven, as though written in secrecy or fear. Only one sentence had survived intact, dark ink still legible despite the years that had passed. "She was alive when we buried her." The words carried with them a chill that the stagnant air of the shop could not explain. They seemed less a confession than a warning, whispered across more than a century. Who had written it, and for whom was it intended? The placement suggested it had been hidden deliberately, sealed within the frame to accompany the photograph through time. Perhaps it was meant to be discovered, or perhaps it was meant to remain locked away forever. But there it was now, exposed to the present, its meaning impossible to dismiss. The silence of the room deepened, as if every object were listening. The face of the young woman in the portrait seemed suddenly altered, less at rest and more unsettled, as though her closed eyes concealed not peace, but protest. Around her, the family members appeared less like mourners and more like witnesses, bound together by an unspoken knowledge. The year etched faintly on the cardboard backing read 1907, a date that now stood not merely as a marker of death, but as the beginning of a riddle that stretched across generations. The photograph, the note, the frame, all of it formed a message, fragmented but undeniable. Something had happened in that year, something never recorded in official words, yet preserved in a single desperate line. The discovery carried with it the gravity of trespassing, as though by reading the sentence, one had disturbed the fragile boundary between past and present. Outside, the day continued with its indifferent rhythm, but within the confines of that shop, the air seemed colder, the shadows deeper. The portrait no longer appeared as a relic of mourning. It had become evidence, evidence of what no one could yet say, only that the past had spoken, and its voice trembled with accusation. The note was brief, but it left behind a trail that demanded to be followed. The year 1907 was more than an inscription. It was a key. Local archives, brittle from neglect, offered glimpses into a community that once thrived on industry and silence. Names filled the yellowed pages of registries, lists of births, deaths, and marriages, each recorded with a precision that spoke of duty rather than compassion. Among them appeared a single entry that aligned with the date and the image. Eleanor Whitford, age 22, cause of death listed simply as fever. The official documents gave no further detail. The ink, neat and orderly, carried no trace of hesitation. Yet the simplicity of the record stood in contrast to the weight of the note found behind the portrait. It was as if two truths had been written side by side, one for the public and one for the shadows. Newspapers of the period painted a portrait of mourning without mystery. A brief column reported the loss of a beloved daughter, describing her as delicate, graceful, and kind, struck down suddenly by illness. The words carried the ornamental language of the era, meant to soften the brutality of death. But within the folds of those same pages lay silences too sharp to ignore. There was no mention of the attending physician, no detail of her final hours, no testimony of comfort given or prayers whispered. Instead, there was haste. The burial had taken place less than a day after the announcement of her death. The priest officiated quickly, with only immediate relatives present. No public service, no extended wake, no time for the town to gather. For a family of standing, as the Whitfords were described, such brevity was uncharacteristic. The omission itself was louder than words. Whispers survive longer than records, and scattered among the memories of descendants were fragments of unease. A neighbor's diary, preserved in a private collection, recalled hearing the tolling of the church bell before dawn, though the death had been reported only hours before. Another source, a letter never sent, spoke of the Whitfords' insistence on privacy, their refusal to allow the physician to conduct a second examination when Eleanor's breathing faltered. These scraps of recollection, never meant for history, carried the resonance of suspicion. The more one traced the lines of her story, the more gaps emerged. Her name appeared in no hospital register. The doctor assigned to the case left no surviving notes. Even the burial record was spare. No details of the grave beyond its location on the far edge of the cemetery, near the tree line where stones were often left unmarked. It was not only what was missing, but the way absence repeated itself, like a shadow cast over every record. The town had recorded her death, yet all signs of life had been carefully withdrawn. To say she had died of fever was a statement that asked no questions. To bury her within hours was an act that silenced them. In the stillness of these archives, one could almost hear the whisper of the note again, its ink trembling across the parchment. She was alive when we buried her. Whether confession, accusation, or curse, it had fastened itself to her name, refusing to be forgotten. The official words preserved her as a victim of illness, but the hidden message suggested something far darker, that Eleanor Whitford's end was not written by nature, but by human hands. The photograph, when studied closely, revealed more than the solemnity of death. Its surface carried imperfections not entirely explained by age or the crude technology of early cameras. At first glance, the image was conventional for its time. The deceased arranged with flowers, family standing nearby, all fixed in the stillness demanded by grief. Yet beneath the calm veneer, troubling details surfaced, fragments that resisted silence. The face of the young woman bore a tension uncommon in portraits of the dead. Her lips were not fully closed, but parted slightly, as though caught in the last act of speech or breath. One eye, instead of resting in serene finality, seemed to hover half shut, a fragile border between wakefulness and surrender. The camera, unyielding in its precision, had captured something less than rest, something unsettled. Around her, the arrangement of the family told its own uneasy story. Their expressions were stiff, but not only with sorrow. There was a rigidity that suggested burden, as if each figure bore knowledge too heavy to speak. The father's gaze seemed fixed not upon his daughter, but past her, as though refusing to meet what the lens recorded. The mother's hand hovered uncertainly at her side, fingers curled as though in hesitation. Even the younger siblings, posed as tradition dictated, carried the strange vacancy of those asked to remain silent. The body itself betrayed contradictions. The stiffness of her posture appeared unnatural, her hands pressed too tightly together, the bouquet held as if forced into place. A faint blur marked the outline of her neck, as though she had shifted, minutely, imperceptibly, at the moment the shutter clicked. In the era of long exposures, such movement was rare but not impossible. Yet here, it carried a weight more sinister, the trace of a body not entirely surrendered to stillness. The background details offered no comfort. A curtain hung behind her chair, bore deep creases, suggesting the haste with which it had been arranged. The chair itself was slightly misaligned. the kind chosen not for dignity, but convenience. These were signs of urgency rather than ritual, of a scene composed quickly, perhaps under pressure of time. It was impossible to ignore the history of the period. Medical science, though advancing, was still uncertain, and errors of premature burial were not unheard of. Newspapers from the late 19th and early 20th centuries told of coffins reopened to reveal scratch marks within, of bells installed in graveyards to signal the living mistakenly condemned to the earth. Fear of such fates was woven into the fabric of daily existence. The portrait, with its imperfections, seemed to echo those collective terrors. Yet the unease it evoked felt sharper than mere accident. The note discovered within the frame returned insistently to the mind. She was alive when we buried her. If the photograph truly caught her in the borderland between life and death, then its existence was not simply a record of mourning, but a testimony of complicity. Someone had known, someone had seen, and yet the ritual continued, earth closing over a body that had not finished breathing. The evidence was subtle, but once perceived, it could not be dismissed. The portrait ceased to resemble a farewell and began to resemble a crime. Every blurred line, every uncertain gaze, every hurried detail of its composition pointed toward a truth too dreadful to acknowledge openly. What remained was silence, preserved in silver nitrate, locked within a frame that concealed its own accusation. The young woman's image, instead of resting in peace, seemed to struggle eternally in the narrow space between remembrance and revelation. The note discovered behind the portrait was never meant to exist alone. Its torn edges suggested it had once been part of something longer, a confession or testimony severed by deliberate hands. When examined more carefully, faint traces of ink on the reverse side revealed additional words, fractured phrases that trembled on the edge of coherence. The parchment had darkened with age, the letters blurred by moisture and time, yet certain fragments resisted erasure. They spoke not of mourning, but of fear. They insisted. The priest agreed. She screamed when the soil covered her. The words broke apart like echoes, but their meaning carried a weight that no century could diminish. Whoever wrote them had witnessed more than a simple burial. They had seen resistance. They had heard a voice that should not have existed in the silence of the grave. Speculation arises from the shape of the handwriting itself. It was hurried, uneven, not the neat record of a clerk or priest, but the trembling script of someone compelled to speak, even at risk of being silenced. The ink was darker in certain places, pressed heavily into the fibers of the page, as though urgency drove the hand to dig deeper. It was not the writing of ceremony, but of desperation. If the author was a member of the household, their silence in public records becomes understandable. To accuse one's own family would mean exile, or worse, a fate similar to that of the woman in the coffin. If the words belonged to the photographer, they explain the unusual intimacy of the image, the details captured as if in defiance of those present. Both possibilities share one truth. The writer was close enough to see and close enough to fear. The mention of the priest deepens the shadow. Religious authority in small communities often stood above law or medicine, its decisions rarely questioned. If he confirmed death, then the ritual of burial followed, regardless of doubt. The fragment suggests agreement not sought through faith, but through compliance, an alignment of silence to ensure the act proceeded unchallenged. Whether complicit or deceived, the priest's role in the story is one of finality, binding the living to the grave with sacred words that concealed their cruelty. The most harrowing phrase remains the last. She screamed when the soil covered her. Though incomplete, it is enough to summon the terror of a burial not of the dead, but of the dying. The image of earth falling onto a body that still resisted its fate lingers like a wound across the century. It was not illness that stole her breath, but the weight of secrecy and the cold pressure of the ground. No more of the letter survives. Its missing portion might have named the guilty, or explained the reason for such a hurried interment. Perhaps it detailed a family shame, a scandal buried with the daughter to preserve appearances, or perhaps it was nothing more than the unburdening of a witness who could no longer bear the silence. Whatever its nature, the fragment alone was enough to change the meaning of the photograph forever. What had once seemed a simple artifact of mourning now read as evidence of a darker narrative. The portrait and the note formed two halves of the same message, an image of death and a voice insisting that death had not yet come. In their union, the silence of the past cracked open, revealing the echo of screams that no earth could fully conceal. The path of the investigation led inevitably to those who bore the Whitford name in later generations. Records traced through censuses and family trees revealed a scattered lineage, with branches that had migrated across states and even across oceans. Yet when approached, the living descendants reacted not with curiosity, but with retreat. Letters sent received no reply. Calls ended abruptly. One distant relative, when pressed for comment, allowed only a single sentence before closing the door. That photograph should never have been found. It was as though the family carried a shadow they refused to name, a burden passed down not in words, but in silence. Documents that should have been preserved, diaries, correspondence, estate records, were conspicuously absent, burned or discarded at some unknown point. The gaps themselves felt deliberate, a curation of forgetting designed to protect the living from the memory of the dead. Among the few willing to speak, hesitation shaped every phrase. A historian who had studied the town's past lowered his voice when the name Whitford was mentioned, as though the weight of the family still lingered despite the passing of a century. He admitted only this, that whispers had always surrounded Eleanor's burial, and that children in the town were once warned not to wander near her grave at night. The grave, however, was no longer marked. The stone had either eroded beyond recognition or been removed entirely, leaving the place of her rest untraceable among the rows of weathered markers. In the silence of the descendants, a pattern emerged. Fear, inherited like an heirloom, had shaped their responses. What was once a single burial had grown into a legacy of avoidance, a pact to bury memory as thoroughly as earth had once buried flesh. The refusal to speak did not erase the past, it only deepened the impression that the story was true, too dangerous to surface, too shameful to confront. One account, offered reluctantly by an elderly neighbor who recalled stories from her grandmother, carried the weight of finality. She said the Whitfords never returned to the cemetery after the day of the burial. The family estate fell into disrepair, abandoned within a generation, and their name was mentioned in hushed tones as though cursed. The rumor, she claimed, was that one member of the family had broken under guilt and confessed privately, but the church sealed the testimony, refusing to let it stain the sanctity of its records. Whether fact or invention, the story aligned with the fragments of the torn letter and the photograph that refused to remain silent. The threads of the mystery converge not in clarity, but in uncertainty. The evidence does not resolve into a single truth. It multiplies into shadows, a torn letter, a hurried burial, a photograph filled with unease, and a family that chose silence over remembrance. Each element points toward a secret deliberately smothered, a voice buried yet still audible in fragments. At the end, only a reflection remains. How many other portraits, tucked away in forgotten drawers or hanging unnoticed on walls, conceal within their frames messages meant to disturb the future? How many voices, denied the dignity of truth, wait still beneath layers of silence, their stories pressing faintly against the fragile glass of time?